webcast, your recording, you may want to sit. They also need to be seen for your recording or webcast. No, that's the projector. I can do something for you, though. Actually, how about that?
One of the environmental aspects I'm missing in all this wonderful research is radon, because that is affecting all of us and it's pretty well documented. It's something that we can measure and we know what to do about it to some extent, and it exists in every single structure, and especially these government buildings and universities where there's basement, like what we're in right now, where we're on ground level. I'm just wondering if you wouldn't rope that into all this exciting and wonderful research.
So I'm not going to pretend to be too educated on radon, but I do believe radon started the whole movement of air quality monitoring probably 5 or 10 years back, and they came out with some of the first low-cost radon sensors, and people were walking around collecting the data and crowdsourcing the data for the first time, and we saw the potential of these personalized wearable monitors. I think they're not being monitored on an ongoing real-time basis because I think most of radon can be eliminated through building material selection. And so knowing that your building has radon once it's already built is sort of counterproductive unless somebody's willing to do some sort of intervention. So anyways, I don't know a lot about it, but that's my take on it.
Well, and I would say the reason we're not doing it, and I'll turn that to Casey too, is it's more of a state than or it's more of, if you will, a trait example of a building. It's ongoing, and we're looking at real-time changes of various environmental attributes that vary moment to moment, and that can be linked to human health outcomes. Casey, do you?
Yeah, the only thing that I'd add to that, is that a lot of the VOCs or other things that we know are bad for you, that we've measured so far, particularly at these buildings and another couple test facilities, is that, sorry, this is really bad, is that there's, when there's very little variability, so it's either there or it's not, it doesn't give you a lot of predictive power for the outcome. So there really has to be this variability over the day, over the week, or something like that for you to understand its impact on something that is variable, like the physiology or psychology of a person. So I'm definitely not an expert in anything radon related, but if it does fall in that category of other things that we know are harmful, they're there or they're not. They're often at the level of this is safe, it's not there, or it's there and it's a problem. But it's not the thing that's going to vary over time with the physiological and psychological response.
Well, wouldn't it just be important to have it mentioned at least for the architects?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a static measurement that could and should be there. Absolutely.
It's kind of gotten off the radar, for the economists. Hear much about it anymore.
Right, I think we're testing in facilities where you know it doesn't have those aspects, so that's why.
This is on. Okay. I think it's great. It's very exciting, all the research that's being done and finally connecting things that I think for some people are intuitive, like it's not good to have people working with no access to daylight, but to really making strong connections that way. I guess one thing that I have been concerned about over the years has been this the connection that people are making to return on investment. And so I remember 15 years ago when we started talking about creating productive workplaces, there were two things. One was a building manager said, well, how much do I need to invest to increase productivity X amount? The other one was a serious proposal that if you have an office where the receptionist makes $30,000 and the managers make $150,000, shouldn't you have better air quality for the people making more money because you get a better return on investment? So I think that what's very valuable is this is helping to set the baseline for a healthy workplace. And I think that going in that direction and using all these different devices to verify how things are going is very important. But at some point, there's and this has come in and out of the sustainability movement. A few years ago, there's an ethics conference that had a session of engineers talking about sustainability in the sense of ethics in engineering, because that's the way they're sort of getting into the door. So I'm throwing out, maybe that's another level, or are you talking to people in the philosophy department, Esther? So.
Yes. No, we're working with humanities and across the board. I mean, that's one of the great things about being at a university. You have a lot of different experts to contribute. But I think I agree with your points. Also law, very important.
All right, so this was a fantastic panel. I was so excited to see light be so much of a theme. I think in years past, that has not been as much of a theme in the conference, so thank you for your leadership in bringing that to this forum. And so my real question is talking about data, right? The world of if I have the data, then as a user, I'll be able to interpret that, and I'll be able to know what best to do. This kind of argument, right? If I know how many steps I'm going to take, then I'll take more steps. And when you talk about light, and you talk about air quality, and you talk about this kind of data, although our argument is that people are the best sensors, are people the best interpreters of the data? And Mariana, you made the point of let's get the data from the user and then have the facility manager being able to then maybe shape their space differently, or someone's tuning in the back of the stage to actually change their environment based on what they need. So I wanted you guys to talk a little bit about the sort of trend behind the trend of now that you have all the data, who will be interpreting it? And do we really trust people to understand how to interpret their data best? And I'd like to focus it a little bit on lighting first.
Just one point is, no, I don't think it should be the facility manager controlling it. I really think you should have your personal sort of environment where
Sweet.
your personal environment where your sensor is communicating with your personal environment. It's not somebody else doing it for you. In terms of data interpretation, one thing about the circadian system is that we talk a lot about that in the lab is unlike with hunger where you know when you're hungry because your stomach starts complaining, you don't know when you're disrupted because you don't have access to your biological clock. So what the technologists do is just giving you a clue. All right, perhaps this is time for you to get some light, or perhaps this is time for you to go to bed, or perhaps this is time for you to... So it gives you at least some idea of where you are. Will it replace your brain? No, and it shouldn't. But at least it gives you some indication as to, perhaps you shouldn't go behind the wheel now because you're tired or something like that to give you at least some idea. But I think ultimately, you know yourself best. That's what they say about medicine, right? It's, as much as the physician will tell you something, you know best when you're good, when you're not feeling good, and so on. And I think that has to continue. You're just using the technology as a glucose meter or something that will help you, give you a clue as to where you are. That's at least my view.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. But that's why we're, working with the psychology department and why we hired Casey, who has a PhD in psychology and architecture. So in our first study, in the Denver study, people were not consciously aware of how their surroundings affected them, but people are consciously aware of comfort. So, I think you need to have all of the above, like we pointed out. You can't just measure the physiology or the behavior, or you can't just measure the psychology and the moods. You have to put it all together.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that, I completely agree with you guys, the overall sentiment. And the only thing that you would... that I would add to that, I guess, is that we're talking about agency here, right? And agency is really important. So even if someone, or a sense of agency, So even if you don't have control over something, but you think you do, that's a big deal for how you're going to respond to that. And I'm glad we're on this side, because this is something I saw when fMRI results started coming out. People said, "Oh, now we know the truth, or we know the whole story or something." And it's just another tool. It's just another level of analysis that tells us something that's going on in the brain, and that's exactly what this is. But your first part of the question is, how good are people at understanding that data and using it? And we don't know that yet, right? We have no idea, because we're at that first step, but that's a really interesting question.
Let me just say something along what he said. We one time went in to just look at people's want of control, and we took 8 thermostats of it in the classrooms. Complaints, they didn't do anything. I mean, they could punch them all they want. The feeling of control is what people want.
And more so, depending on the personality that you have, that feeling of control is more important or less important. So we're talking another variable here, individual differences again. Keeping those traditional measures that maybe people wrote off in different fields, but basic personality measures can tell you a lot about this if you know about your workforce.
The challenge is when someone has data about their air quality and they cannot do anything, they have no ability to control their environment, and they cannot get up and move. So we've just disabled them with data, arguably, and we've created another issue. And that's kind of thinking beyond that too. The big thermostat we all know, which was just that you get up and do something instead of complaints with them. So there is the possibility and the threat of using our data without control.
And I think there'll be a lot more discussion of that as we move into other panels today. But that is a very important point. If you're going to give people information, they have to think it's going somewhere.
Great presentation. I have a quick question on environmental epigenetics. So there's been a lot of work recently linking exposure to long-term chronic illnesses and chronic issues, and in particular exposure for certain types of populations and at certain times, particularly say for women or pregnancy or children, very vulnerable populations. And I'm wondering if there's any work linking some of the work that you're doing on exposure with some of these really vulnerable populations. So I know we're talking about the workplace now, but let's be honest, that's some of the most vulnerable populations in other places.
This whole field is just very new. As you know, and when Bill Riley spoke, the focus at NIH was until now the genetics. And the environment was not really, it was something you had to get rid of, right? When you did animal studies, you had to get rid of the environmental variables. When you do human studies, you have to get rid of those pesky environmental variables, even though they contribute about 60 to 70% and sometimes more to the risk for any given disease. The genetic variance is relatively low. It's 35 to 40% contribution. And so I think we're beginning to shift now from where we were for decades of getting rid of those environmental variables, focusing on the toxins in the environment and getting rid of them. That's also where things were. And now we're moving into this next stage. And I think part of the reason that we're doing it is because of the availability of these fantastic technologies that were not available even 5 years ago or 2 years ago. So it's a very exciting time in medicine, in health, in environmental health, and all of the above, where we have the tools to begin to answer these questions.
I'm sorry, I just want to add, there is one work that has been done at Fox Chase Cancer Center. They were Irma Russo and Jose Russo. I don't know if anybody knows. They were looking at their whole hypothesis that cancer is a childhood disease, and what they were looking at is sometimes you have an environmental insult in your adolescence when you go from pre-puberty to post-puberty, and that you imprint that, and then later in life, if you have an environmental insult, that can sort of manifest. And I think making the link, which is it's a hypothesis, which I would love to pursue because I think it's an interesting hypothesis. We've done some work with adolescents looking at self-luminous displays and how it affects melatonin levels. And it's remarkable how adolescents are much more sensitive to light for acute melatonin suppression than, say, people in their 20s. So if you stop and think about it, if we can show that, it would be a very easy sort of, they wouldn't have that environmental insult, which would be that suppression of melatonin, which has been linked to, decreased risk for cancer and so on. So there's some sort of pieces that I think could be linked together to sort of more specific research investigating some of these hypotheses.
Well, and also that's the goal of the Precision Medicine Initiative. As you notice, they go from genome all the way up.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all of you. This is excellent initiatives in respective fields, and you're trying to. It's an amalgamation of different disciplines that you're trying to bring together. So it's excellent and it's really hard. So thanks a lot to all of you. I have a couple of questions, but we're running short on time, so I'll just ask one of the questions, and that's for Esther Sternberg. And when you showed that graph regarding the peak performance, right? You had that graph, you said stress level and calm level. My question is, do we really have an accurate way for measuring peak performance? Because we have indirect ways of measuring stress. We do not necessarily have ways of measuring relaxation either. So how do you actually determine that, and how do you assess and implement it as well?
So in our definition, the relaxation response, which was the word was coined by Herb Benson, is the opposite of the stress response. So the physiological stress response, which the term was coined in 1950 or 36 actually by Hans Selye. So that's the stress response, the fight or flight that everybody's familiar with. Herb Benson at Harvard coined the relaxation response, which is mediated by the vagus nerve. And you can measure that extremely accurately, the relaxation response, as to whether you feel relaxed. It's the physiological relaxation response using heart rate variability. And that is what heart rate variability is most sensitive and accurate for detecting. Now, whether you feel relaxed or you're in a relaxed mood, the only way we have of getting at it now is by questions as Casey mentioned, sent to the smartphone. And you've got to link all these different layers, because just measuring the physiology isn't good enough. Just measuring the questions or your answers, your subjective feelings, isn't good enough. But you merge the two and many other measures of performance, task performance. I'll leave it to Casey to fill in the blanks. But it's, again, the issue is you can't use any one single method, because you're going to miss the whole picture.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that, right, your question was about measuring performance, right, along that curve, peak performance. Right, so it's hard, and it depends on which task is at hand and which individual is doing that task and what time of day, right? So each of those is going to have a curve, though. So maybe for someone that's afraid of math and thinks that they suck at math, they're going to not need to be very aroused at all, because that arousal is going to come on pretty quick. But when they do a reading task or a comprehension task or something like that, that phase is going to be shifted far to the right. But you'll be able to see over time, if you have people do enough tasks, where that curve lies for each individual on each measure. But that's obviously a lot. You need a lot of data on a lot of measures. Yeah.
Yeah, and as the devil is in the details. You have to be very specific if you're going to do rigorous research of exactly how you're defining your outcomes. Ultimately, what we're doing is defining health. That's a big, big word, or it's a small word for a very big area. And health and well-being then incorporates the psychological aspects, emotional aspects, and that's a very big area.
Yeah, my question is to Kevin. What level of sensitivity are we talking about with your instrument, level of detection, like PM and the VOCs?
We actually just finished the test. We were in a laboratory, and we had monodispersed particles. So this is particles of only one size. And we had 1 micron particles, 4 micron, 7 micron particles. with our particulate matter sensor. And we're looking at the response in our sensor's binning of the different particle sizes based on the peak. So as the particles cross the optical sensor, these particles give off an intensity of light. And so we can look at the peak light, and based on that, we can tell the size of the particles. We have 145 different channels of particle sizing. And so we saw exactly a very specific response to 1 micron particles, which is quite a bit above the noise floor of where you lose the signal. And so we know for a fact that we can see into the sub-micron particles and all the way up to 10, and with a great deal of confidence we can discern different types of particles. And eventually we'd like to be able to sort of build waveforms of particles and see, you know, is this a double-headed particle and what does this mean, and really dig into the analytics of it. But, I mean, it's a very capable sensor that we're building.
But I think what he wants is detection limits.
Detection limits, we've detected several, not micrograms, but several milligrams per meter cubed in a chamber, and accurately, like, did not reach saturation. And the 1 micron particle tests were in a very low saturation environment. And so we're doing tests right now with the EPA, with Air Quality Management District in the south coast of California, and a couple other universities, and they've all got our sensors now. And I'd like to be able to give you my own results, but I'd rather rely on third-party results so that they don't refute my results. And you'll be seeing those in early January.